There are moments in this war that should stop the world cold. Moments so deliberate, so calculated, so nakedly contemptuous of every rule that human civilization has constructed around the conduct of armed conflict, that the only honest response is outrage. Not measured diplomatic language, not carefully worded statements of concern. Outrage. The kind that demands action, demands accountability, demands that someone somewhere actually does something to make it stop. The night of April 30th into May 1st, 2026, was one of those moments. While most of Europe slept, while diplomats in Washington and Brussels shuffled papers about peace frameworks and ceasefire proposals and negotiating frameworks, while the world's attention was focused on a dozen other crises competing for the same limited bandwidth of international concern, Russia launched 210 strike drones at Ukraine. 210 in a single night.
Approximately 140 of them were Shahed drones, the Iranian-designed kamikaze weapons that Russia has been mass-producing inside its own borders and sending into Ukrainian skies in waves that have become, 4 years into this war, as routine as weather. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky described the attack himself in plain, exhausted language that carried more weight than any diplomatic communique could manage. Russia continues to attack the energy sector, critical infrastructure, and civilian facilities. That was his message to the world on the morning of May 1st, 2026. Not a cry for help, not a dramatic appeal, just a statement of fact delivered by a man who has been making the same statement in different words for over 4 years, and who has learned that the world will read it, perhaps feel something briefly, and then move on. But let us not move on. Let us sit with what actually happened that night. Let us look at the specific targets, the specific communities, the specific human beings who woke up on May 1st to find their city on fire, their home damaged, their neighborhood in chaos, their sense of safety, which was already worn down to almost nothing after 4 years of this, shattered once again. The primary target that night was Odessa, Ukraine's great southern port city, a city of nearly 1 million people, a city that sits on the Black Sea and has been, throughout this war, one of the most strategically important and most repeatedly attacked urban centers in the country. The governor of the Odessa region, Oleg Kiper, confirmed on the morning of May 1st that Russia had massively attacked the civilian infrastructure of his region overnight. 2 people were injured. 2 high-rise residential buildings were struck by drones. Apartments destroyed, fires breaking out across multiple floors, families scrambling in the middle of the night to escape burning buildings, emergency services responding to a scene of destruction that has become grimly familiar to every firefighter and rescue worker in southern Ukraine. But Odessa was not the only target. It never is. Because what Russia has mastered in this war, what makes its approach so strategically devastating and so morally monstrous simultaneously, is the simultaneous, multi-front, multi-city nature of its attacks. While Odessa burned, Russian forces attacked the Black Sea shipbuilding town of Mykolaiv with drones. The head of the Ukrainian Defense Ministry confirmed that 4 settlements in the Kherson community were subjected to enemy attacks overnight. 1 person killed, 8 injured. In the Dnipropetrovsk region in central Ukraine, Russian forces struck 3 districts nearly 20 times with drones and artillery. Infrastructure was damaged in Kryvyi Rih. A private house was destroyed, a petrol station obliterated, an administrative building struck, buses burned. In the Nikopol district, multiple communities were hit. In Kherson city, drone attacks continued for 24 hours straight. In Kherson, Zimivnik, Komishani, and Zelenivka. In Kharkiv, Ukraine's second largest city, a city of over 1 million people that has been under near constant Russian attack since February 2022, Russian forces struck 4 gas stations in the morning hours of May 1st and 1 in the city of Chuhuv. 2 people were injured, 10 cars were damaged. Gas stations, not military installations, not weapons depots, not command centers, gas stations. Places where ordinary people fill their tanks to drive to work, to take their children to school, to maintain the basic functioning of daily life in a city that refuses to stop living despite being within artillery range of Russia for over 4 years. In the Zolotonosha district of Cherkasy region, a city in central Ukraine, far from the front lines, a place that might have seemed relatively safe, debris from a Russian drone and the blast wave from its impact damaged a kindergarten during an air raid alert. A kindergarten, a place built for children, a place where Ukrainian toddlers and young children spend their days learning, playing, growing, and which was struck by Russian weapons on the afternoon of May 1st, 2026. Air Defense Forces shot down 190 of the 210 drones launched. That is a remarkable interception rate by any measure. Ukraine's air defenders worked through the night, crew after crew, interceptor after interceptor, preventing the vast majority of the incoming weapons from reaching their targets. But the mathematics of this war are brutal, and they do not favor the defender. 190 drones shot down means 20 drones that were not shot down, 20 drones that reached their targets, 20 explosions in residential neighborhoods, in port facilities, in gas stations, in kindergartens. And Russia can absorb the loss of 20 drones without any strategic consequence whatsoever, because it will launch 200 more tomorrow night. This is the logic of attritional drone warfare that Russia has perfected over 4 years of practice in Ukrainian skies. The individual drone is cheap. The mass production of Shahed-type weapons inside Russia has driven the cost per unit down to levels that make saturation attacks economically viable even when interception rates exceed 90%. Ukraine must pay to intercept. Russia pays almost nothing to launch. And the 20 drones that get through every night, every week, across every city in the country, they add up. They accumulate. They pile layer after layer of damage on top of damage, destruction on top of destruction, until the cumulative weight of it becomes almost impossible to bear. Total Russian combat losses since February 24, 2022, have now reached approximately 1,331,710 killed and wounded as of May 1st, 2026. On that single day, 1,420 Russian soldiers were reported killed in action. These are staggering numbers, numbers that any democratic government facing that level of military attrition would have found politically unsustainable years ago. But Putin does not govern a democracy. He governs an empire that has recalibrated its entire political economy around absorbing these losses and continuing to fight regardless of the human cost. Because for Putin, losing this war is a more terrifying prospect than the death toll of continuing it. And while Russia was hammering Ukraine's cities overnight, it was also continuing to probe and push along the 1,200-kilometer front line that stretches across the east and south of the country. Since the beginning of May 1st alone, 109 combat engagements were recorded between Ukrainian defense forces and Russian troops. 109 separate moments of contact, of fighting, of soldiers on both sides firing at each other across contested terrain in Donetsk, in Zaporizhzhia, in Kherson, along every axis where Russia is applying pressure and Ukraine is pushing back. Russian troops once again attempted to use a gas pipeline to approach Ukrainian positions, a tactic that has been documented multiple times in this war, using the underground infrastructure of civilian energy networks as a literal pathway for military infiltration. Ukrainian forces struck a concentration of Russian troops in the central part of Hryshayn in a precise airstrike. In the Sumy direction, a special unit of Ukraine's military intelligence carried out an operation to eliminate mercenaries of the Akhmat unit. The Chechen fighters, who have been among the most brutal of Russia's proxy forces throughout this conflict. And yet, as all of this was happening, as Ukrainian cities burned and Ukrainian soldiers fought and Ukrainian civilians sheltered in basements and bomb shelters while drones circled overhead, what was the world doing? This is the question that sits at the heart of what is perhaps the most important moral and strategic dilemma of our era. Not whether Ukraine is fighting bravely, it is. Not whether Russia is committing war crimes, it is, systematically, deliberately, at industrial scale. But whether the international community has the will, the coherence, and the sustained attention to actually do what would be required to stop it. The evidence from the past 4 years is not encouraging. Zelensky's message on the morning of May 1st was not just a description of the overnight attack. It was a call to action. He urged Europe to take more concrete steps to weaken Russia's ability to continue the war, not just to provide defensive weapons so Ukraine can shoot down drones, but to impose costs on Russia that would make continuing the war more painful than ending it. The gap between what Ukraine needs to end this war and what the international community has been willing to provide has never been fully closed. Weapons have come, eventually, after months of debate and delay. Air defense systems have arrived. Not enough of them, but some. Sanctions have been imposed, significant ones, but with enough loopholes and exemptions that Russia has been able to adapt and survive them. But the fundamental military reality has not changed. Russia is still launching 200 drones a night. Russia is still killing Ukrainian civilians in their apartments and injuring people at gas stations and damaging kindergartens with its weapons. Russia is still advancing, slowly but persistently, along the front line. And the international community is still debating, still deliberating, still arguing over the terms and conditions and red lines and escalation thresholds that constrain any response that might actually make a decisive difference. The United Nations has been clear about what is happening. More than 50,000 Ukrainian civilians have been killed or injured since the conflict began. The actual number is almost certainly higher, because monitoring access in frontline and occupied areas is severely limited and many casualties go unreported. Every year of this war, more civilians die than the year before. That is the trend. That is the direction in which this is moving. Not toward resolution, not toward stabilization, but toward escalation, toward more deaths, more destruction, more suffering, year after year after year. Russia's attacks on civilian infrastructure are not a side effect of military operations. They are the military operation. The systematic targeting of Ukraine's energy grid, the strikes on residential buildings, the attacks on port facilities, the destruction of hospitals and schools. These are not accidents or miscalculations. They are the deliberate execution of a strategy designed to make Ukrainian civilian life so unbearable that the population loses the will to continue resisting occupation. The International Criminal Court has recognized this. Multiple governments have formally designated Russia's actions as war crimes. The documentation exists. The evidence is overwhelming. And yet the attacks continue night after night with complete impunity. On the same night that Russia launched 200 drones at Ukrainian cities, Russian forces also fired on state emergency service rescue workers who were extinguishing a fire at a postal warehouse in Kherson. Read that again. Rescue workers, people whose entire purpose is to save lives, to put out fires, to protect civilians from the consequences of the very attacks Russia is launching, were themselves targeted while doing their jobs. This is not an isolated incident. This is a pattern documented throughout this war. The deliberate targeting of first responders, of medical personnel, of humanitarian workers. a pattern that represents one of the most fundamental violations of the laws of armed conflict, a pattern for which Russia has faced no meaningful military consequence. The ports and maritime infrastructure of the Odessa region, through which Ukraine exports grain, sunflower oil, and other agricultural products that feed not just Ukraine, but much of the developing world, were struck again in the overnight attack. The Black Sea grain corridor, which at various points during this war has been opened through international negotiations and then closed again by Russian military pressure, has been a constant target. When Russia attacks Odessa's port infrastructure, it is not just attacking Ukraine. It is attacking the global food supply chain that depends on Ukrainian agricultural exports. It is creating conditions that contribute to food insecurity in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. The consequences of Russia's war on Ukraine extend far beyond the borders of the two countries directly involved. And yet, the international response has never fully reflected the global scale of what is at stake. What would it actually take for the world to do something that matters? That is not a rhetorical question. It deserves a serious answer. It would require Western governments to provide Ukraine with the full range of weapons and capabilities it needs to not just defend its territory, but to impose costs on Russia's ability to conduct offensive operations, including long-range systems capable of striking the Russian territory from which these drones and missiles are launched. It would require genuinely enforcing sanctions in a way that actually cuts off Russia's access to the revenues and technologies it needs to sustain its war machine, which means addressing the loopholes through which Russian oil continues to flow to third countries and Russian entities continue to access dual-use components through intermediaries. It would require European countries to follow through on the commitments they have made regarding defense spending, military assistance, and strategic support for Ukraine, not as aspirational goals for the next decade, but as urgent operational realities for this year. And it would require the world to resist the narrative of fatigue, the gradual erosion of attention and urgency that comes from 4 years of watching a crisis that has not resolved itself. The temptation to treat Ukraine's war as background noise, as something that has been happening for so long that it no longer demands the full weight of moral and political attention, is real and it is dangerous. Because the moment the world fully stops paying attention is the moment Russia's strategy of exhaustion starts to work. 210 drones, one night, one person killed in Kherson, 8 injured in the same region. 2 people injured in Odessa, a kindergarten damaged in Cherkasy, gas stations destroyed in Kharkiv, apartments burning in high-rise buildings along the Black Sea coast, rescue workers fired upon while doing their jobs. This happened on May 1st, 2026. This is what Russia does, every single night, in the dark, while the world sleeps, while diplomats draft communiques, while politicians debate red lines. The drones keep flying, and the fires keep burning, and Ukrainian civilians keep dying in their homes and their streets and their cities. The world did nothing that night to stop it. The same way it has done nothing sufficient to stop it on every other night for the past 4 years. And until something changes, until the calculations shift, until the costs to Russia of continuing exceed the costs of stopping, the drones will keep flying. This is the World Order Lab. Stay locked in.